Kindle the fire of love and burn away all things. Then set thy foot into the land of the lovers. Kindle the fire of love and burn away all things. Then set thy foot into the land of the lovers.
How many of you remember when the House of Justice released the Kitab al-Aqdas? How many of you remember that? Do you have a story about how it came to Iceland? Does anybody want to share something? Or wherever you were, actually. How do you remember getting your first copy of the Kitab al-Aqdas? What year was it? I'll give you a hint. It was the centenary of the passing of Baha'u'llah. 1992, very good. Everybody's like, uh-oh. I didn't know there would be a test. 1992.
I can remember
Yeah.
I was at the conference in America.
In New York.
New York. I bought it there.
You bought it there. Isn't that amazing? It wasn't until 1992, in our lifetime, that we had the translation of the Kitab al-Aqdas. I think that's pretty significant. Because we forget that we're still in those early years of our faith. What is the Baha'i year?
175.
That's it! 175. What is the Christian year?
2018.
Imagine when we're 2018 years into the Baha'i revelation. We're only in the year 175. We forget that sometimes, that we're so close. We're so close, yet so far. Right? My father, I was telling the table I was sitting with this morning, that whenever he saw something in the world that didn't align with the writings of Baha'u'llah, he would say, it's definitely not the golden age. The reason why I bring up the Kitab al-Aqdas, it's because it's so critical for us to understand. It's only, first of all, one of about 100 published volumes of Baha'u'llah's writings, which is unique in and of itself. And there is thousands and thousands of pages of scripture which have not yet been translated. So can you imagine the wealth of information that we have directly from the manifestation of God? But the Kitab al-Aqdas, as Baha'u'llah says, is not merely a code of law. It's not merely a set of laws. It's not just about do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. It is intended to reconceptualize the very foundation of society. Reconceptualize. What is, we have a concept and we want to reconceptualize it. So we thought about oneness and interconnectedness yesterday and how that looks through the filter of the revelation. So I want us to push a little bit more on that, go a little bit deeper on that. We know from The Guardian that the Kitab al-Aqdas is founded in past religions, but Baha'u'llah very clearly sets the revelation apart from the past understanding of certain concepts. For example, take gender equality. Baha'u'llah very clearly states men and women are equal. And it has always been so. But it took time for social laws to change and make that realization and conceptual thinking true equality. We're still learning that, actually. We're still learning that. It goes beyond income inequality. It goes beyond that. What does it mean to truly understand the equality of men and women? If you think about religious scripture over time, women in the Old Testament were brought up to the level of property. If you look at it through the lens of 2018, Baha'i era 175, That seems so outdated. But in that time, when women were not even considered property, elevating women in social laws to the level of property was a protection. In the New Testament, Mary Magdalene was elevated to the station of a believer. She had her own spiritual identity, and that was an elevation of women's station. In the Quran, first believer in Muhammad was his wife. Elevated that. Who was the first believer in the revelation of the Bab? Mullah Hussein. So imagine the reverence we have for Mullah Hussein and the reverence that Muslims have for the wife of Muhammad. And yet look how far gender equality looks in Islam as compared to the Baha'i revelation. So this progressive nature doesn't just end with the revelation of Baha'u'llah. In fact, the Kitab al-Aqdas, as the Guardian describes, is intended for progressive application of the law of Baha'u'llah. The House of Justice was very clear in 1992, and they said the release of this book does not mean all the Baha'i world has to abide by everything set down in it. There is a level of preparedness that society has to go through before the House of Justice demands that all Baha'is follow everything in the Kitab al-Aqdas. This is a very unique aspect of the Baha'i system of governance. It's very unique. It's called the progressive application of the law. What do you remember having been applied most recently, maybe within the last 10, 12 years, depending on which country you're from, where now all Baha'is are required to fulfill a certain obligation? That wasn't so.
Say, allow upon 95 times.
I was thinking of the law of Fyrirlestur. Yeah. I was thinking of the law of Fyrirlestur, which is now binding on Baha'is. For the Persian community in Iran, it was binding from the beginning. But it's always a law, but it didn't have to be applied until the House of Justice said it is now mandated. You could have always done the Fyrirlestur as a Baha'i. It was always allowed to do it. But now there's a requirement. Does that make sense? It's a progressive application of that principle. In 1978, there was a series of questions and answers that were added to the codification of the Kitab al-Aqdas. Those questions and answers, which appear in the back, has anybody read some of them? They're interesting set of questions, and you're thinking, why would someone ask them? What's happening? Why is it? So they were compiled by Zainul Mugharibi, one of the secretaries of Baha'u'llah. But I want you to put yourselves in that room around 1873, after the revelation, after the revealing of the Kitab al-Aqdas in the house of Udi Khammar in Akka. Imagine the early believers who received this Kitab al-Aqdas, where Baha'u'llah was talking about concepts that they had no idea how to think about. Men and women are equal. What does that mean? What did that mean in Akka in 1873? In fact, there are diaries of these early believers where they write, I don't know what Baha'u'llah is talking about, this crazy equality of men. Somehow in the future they'll figure it out. I don't get it. But I have faith that this will make sense in the future. So imagine in 1873, the questions that were posed to Baha'u'llah. Can you imagine being in that room and asked, you may now ask a question of the manifestation of God to clarify anything that is written here. Do women get the right to own property? Think about the timing of that. The concepts that they were struggling with to understand with this light that was brought to the world. Which now we think, please, equality of men and women, we're done. Oneness of mankind, of course everybody's equal. Universal education, of course. Of course. Equality of science and religion? What does that mean? What does that mean? We still don't understand it today, by the way. But imagine in 1873, in Akka, with a group of early believers who were in the light of Baha'u'llah and yet had to understand what these concepts were that he was bringing to this world, which we are still learning about. So on the first day, our wonderful schoolmaster said that Bahá'í Summer School is like a university. So I want you to start thinking like a PhD student. By the way, PhD, P stands for perseverance. The H is little because it stands for humility. And D stands for done. Done. Done, London, done. So you don't get the D, but you can get the P and the H, okay? The reason why I say that is because that's what it takes to really conceptualize, reconceptualize, and delve deep into the writings requires perseverance and humility in the sight of God. That if we don't understand a concept, it's not God's fault. It's our fault. It has to do with our limited understanding. So whenever I delve into the writings and I read them, I try not to do it with only my intellect, because this is limited. Trust me, the more education you get, the more limited it gets. It's very strange. I don't understand how that happens. The more you realize you don't know anything. When I was finished with my doctorate and somebody asked a question, I always said, I have no idea. No idea. Because you really start to understand how little you understand of the world that's around you. So even more so as a Baha'i, because you realize the ocean of God's revelation and your little drop. So I want you to think about a concept, and maybe do it in your little tables. What is a concept that you know in your lifetime has changed dramatically from what it was to what it is now? Whatever concept that is. And think about the relationship to the revelation of Baha'i. Whatever concept that is, think about it in your tables. Is it marriage? Is it equality? Is it oneness of mankind? Is it whatever it is? Changes in army, it doesn't matter. Whatever it is, housing, whatever it is, social service, whatever concept it is, think about how something has changed in your context. What is different today than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago? And see if you can link it to the revelation of Baha'u'llah. And if you can't, we'll help you do it. Do this for about 10 minutes. I just want you to get thinking about concepts. Now I want you to write the word empowerment and define that. B, don't worry. I just got excited. So let's hear some sharing. Who would like to share? Which table would like to share?
So I was thinking the leader in the world are more confused. The difficulty is more, and they cannot solve it. And the United Nations and the Security Council, they are just like without hands. They have something to do something, but the other nations say no, and then they, and the trouble of the refugees in the world is increasing, and the trouble which leaders have to consult is more difficult.
How did you relate that to the revelation?
The unity. I mean, what Baha'u'llah say about the unity, and that we should consult the problem.
So the root of these problems is the system is not working. And we know this. We know from the revelation that the system is doomed because it was not founded on the principle of justice and spirituality. Because it does not recognize the oneness of humanity. Because it does not have the tools. We know it, we see it. Do you know these two forces in the world that Baha'u'llah talks about? The Guardian really explains the force of disintegration and integration. The disintegration of the old world order is inevitable. Its time is over. And the integration of a new world system, which is why we're engaged in the 5-year plan. We're in the 20th year almost of the 5-year plan, which is why we're engaged in community building at the local level, which is why we're seeing the example of governance structures slowly. The seeds are being planted, which is why we're asked by Baha'u'llah to focus on this integration, not worry about the disintegration. And you know, the House of Justice is saying the disintegration is going on as planned. It's doing a good job, everything is falling down and breaking and not working. Great. Don't worry about it. We're still going to get hit by it. We still get impacted by it. We live in this world. And as the Guardian says, we human beings are organic with our environment. Whether that's the ecological environment or the social environment, we're organic with it. We can't help but be affected by it. Look at the Baha'is in Iran. As much as they're trying to be resilient, constructive resilience, practicing that in the face of tyranny and oppression, as much as they're faced with the spiritual power that they possess because they believe in Baha'u'llah, they're still impacted. Look at the Baha'is of Yemen, they're still impacted. In the United States, we're definitely impacted. And make no mistake, we recognize that we were not thinking expansively. In the last election of our president, we thought a black man in the White House, we're done. Yeah, we're done. Lesser peace has arrived. Oops, we were not done. Because we hadn't changed the foundation. We just switched someone. And that foundation, the reconceptualization of governance is going to be really important in this day and age. So I think that we get really sad and pessimistic when we focus too much on this disintegration. Have you noticed? We're like, it's never going to change. Did you have a question? Or were you just stretching? Stretching. He's already thinking about Alfred Who would have imagined Iceland was in the World Cup? In 1947, you would not have imagined it was there.
You don't know where is it?
So, you know, this also, think about this at a very fundamental cellular level. Baha'u'llah's revelation is changing concepts. Why is this important? You've heard the House of Justice talk about the contribution to discourse. Contributing to discourse. There is actually, remember PhD? You're in the PhD again. There's something called discourse intervention. It's a theoretical framework. Discourse intervention. It's not a Baha'i thing, but it could be a Baha'i thing. Let me tell you. Discourse intervention says the ways that we think and talk about a concept can not only describe that concept, but it can shape a new way of doing and being. So the assumption is language can not only describe reality, but it can change reality. Whoa. That's a really profound thought.
But are you using language in a broader concept than just words? You're talking about the use of words, consulting.
Also, but words, writing.
Yeah. Okay.
Also words. So how we talk in everyday language, are we having meaningful conversation?
Yeah.
Or are we just talking about the weather with one another because we're scared?
Yeah.
So we can do it we don't have to do it at the level of the PhD all the time. We can do it in everyday conversation.
Yeah.
the moment you connect with someone, rather than just talk about the weather, someone's clothes, backbiting, something. Imagine if you suddenly shifted the conversation to a matter of principle, to something deeper, to make that deep connection. That is also a part of discourse intervention. Imagine going to someone's home who's struggling and saying, you know what, I have a prayer app. Let me bring up a prayer app and let me say a prayer with you about this that you're going. Rather than look Facebook, look YouTube. Oh, prayer app. Discourse intervention doesn't have to be scholarly, but it's really fun as a scholar to be in the discourse intervention space. Let me tell you how I've applied it practically. I am an urban planner and public health specialist, so I work in these spaces of urban planning and public health. So I think about building healthy communities. So I think about the concept of health all the time. What is health?
Not to be sick.
Huh?
Not to be sick.
Not obese.
No, not to be said.
Not to be sick.
Not to be sick. Oh, I thought you meant not obese. I was like, oh, I am not healthy. The opposite of sick.
Yeah.
What is sick?
Equilibrium.
No.
Equilibrium.
Well-being.
What do all these mean? What is well-being?
Being well.
What does that mean?
To keep the spiritual and physical in balance. If we are too physical, we get all kinds of sickness.
And then?
And if you go too spiritually, you forget your body and you don't feed it right.
What else?
You have to keep a balance.
You have to keep balance. What were you saying?
Just including also mental and psychological.
Mental,
Soul, body, intellect, mind, balance.
Do you think we would ever, all of us, agree 100% on the definition of health?
No.
Eh. It's hard. The concept, so everybody thinks they know what the word is because it's very ubiquitous in discourse. Health, health. Everybody says health. What does that actually mean? I decided that I wanted to delve into this concept a little bit. But I wanted to look specifically at health, how it was defined by urban planners, engineers, architects, people that build our society, and how we get around, where we live, where we study. So I went specifically to ask urban planners, engineers, architects, what is health? Their first reaction was anger. That surprised me. Yeah, they were angry with me. What do you mean? Why do you need to ask me about health? I don't do health. I don't know health. I'm not a doctor. Why do you think health is only the world of doctors? Well, I don't know. That's them. Hospital. I'm not a build hospitals. That's, after 5 years of research, that was my conclusion. You now have a PhD. Excellent. Yes, you can have the D now. You can have the D. Yes. Summer School 2018.
Sorry, what was the conclusion? I didn't get it.
The conclusion was that after 5 years of studying, that doctors deal with sick people, not healthy people. I always forget I have a wonderful translation and I speak fast.
But that repetition is lovely.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So after their anger, I started realizing I need to also ask the question a slightly different way. Because what is health became a very political, I didn't know, right, and combative question to these poor engineers who were saying, like the transportation engineers, I don't do health. So I slowly started asking, how do you incorporate people in your design of roads? I had to think a little bit deeper. So the transportation engineers by far defined health as not dead. started to learn how to ask questions, and that's really important.
So we are all healthy in here.
So we're all healthy. According to the transportation engineers, if you're not dead on a road, you are healthy.
Roadkill.
That explains a lot how engineers design roads. Right? For cars, by the way, not for people. Oh, keep that in the back of your heart. Anyway. Then I talked to a group of urban planners that were what we call in the United States desk planners. So they're the ones that receive permission to build somewhere or something there. So basically they're just looking at guidelines. So they're desk planners. So they're just looking at making sure that all the forms are completed. So I said, what is health to you? And they were like, making sure that individuals don't live in an environment that will cause disease. So they were thinking about environmental impact and health impact of development projects. But what that meant, they were really confused. And their answer always was, we're not doctors, we don't know. We're not doctors, we don't know. So there was this funny thing about individual well-being, that then I started asking some community organizations that work on advocating for biking, walking, different types of cities. They defined health as making sure people were not obese. So they said you're healthy if you have a certain BMI, body mass index. If you, so what I started to realize is when I had these conceptual understandings of health, I could directly link it to a specific set of policies, programs, and resource allocation. If a city predominantly thought people who are alive are healthy, all of the resources of that city council would go to police and emergency services. If all of the city thought health is about individual body mass index, all of their resources would go to increasing park space and access to food and nutrition. That's it. So they had less money in police and emergency services, more money in parks. Exercise, healthy eating, that was the focus. The ones that thought about survival did not give funding to parks. And I started to realize, wow, discourse, the way we think and talk about something is so impactful to policy. It's so impactful to planning, to design. How much more so in Baha'i conceptualization for us to really understand what Baha'u'llah, the system of Baha'u'llah has brought. The reason I studied health actually was because it was so close to intervening in well-being, conversations of well-being. I thought I could bring the revelation in that angle to the design of our cities, which are the future habitat of society. So it really helped with this discourse intervention. And I started a campaign. It was an internal campaign. I wanted to change the concept of transportation away from cars to people-centered mobility. So anytime I'm asked to go and talk in front of a city council to give advice or to give research evidence about biking, walking, skateboarding, I don't say walking and biking. I say walking and rolling. Why do you think I say rolling instead of biking?
Anything with wheels.
Anything with wheels? Why is that important? Sorry, how? Disabled, definitely wheelchairs. You have to think about wheelchairs. And if we just say walking and biking, in the United States we say biking tends to privilege mammals. Middle-aged men in lycra. Because we want to get out of that mindset, biking is not just for middle-aged men in lycra who want to go fast and exercise. we're trying to change the concept of mobility to include people on a bike that are using it for utilitarian travel. Going from home to school, going from home to the store. But we also need to have what I call wheel equity. All of this comes from the Revelation. The concepts of oneness of humanity, I translate into the oneness of road uses. Just to show you that this is a very applicable contribution to my discourses in scholarship and practice. It doesn't have to begin and end there. It can be at the very basic level. Think about your conversations with the friends you have of your children's parents. How do you talk about upbringing of children? Think about aging in the Baha'i community, and there is no age limit for service. How do you talk about contributing and serving the community at all ages of life? In your work and profession, there is always an opportunity to bring an element of a meaningful conversation and an element of the revelation of Baha'u'llah into your talking. Friends, the Baha'i faith, what makes it so unique among the many millions of things, what makes it so unique is that we don't have priests. We can't sit back as a community member and say the institution will take care of it. How many times in a consultation, you don't have to give a confession, I know. How many times in a consultation at feast do we hear, you should, the youth should, the assembly should? Stop it. This is not the revelation of Baha'u'llah. The revelation of Baha'u'llah is, I will, I am, I offer. It won't happen with us passively being Baha'is. And in that small space of a conversation is a moment to be active in your application of principle. It's a really critical concept. It's deep, but it's a really critical concept. And you can apply it to anything. So I want to, in that concept, this discourse intervention, I gave you an understanding of health. I want to give a little bit more tangible understanding of the concept of money, for example. What is money? Is it real?
Well, it is.
It's what? It's energy. Sorry. It's an invention of the devil?
Some people say that.
It's initially, I think it was a way of defining value.
There's a way to
among
define value.
strangers or among
Sure.
people who didn't really know each other. Because the barter system was the first way of defining value equally.
Okay, so there was something that came before the concept of money, and it's a value kind of system.
It's a means of exchange.
It's a means of exchange. Something to trade with. Do we need it?
Like, you know, like a value for you, like I give you something, you give me something,
That was very mafioso of you, David. I give you something, you give me something. We have an exchange agreement. Very mafioso. It was totally. It was a system of exchange. But the amount of value we put in it, is it a lifeblood?
No.
If we don't have it, do we die?
No.
Possibly.
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 Tell me, yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me.
because you cannot pay for your health.
You might end up on the street, homeless, with kids, and you no means of getting food unless you're scraping just basically trash. I mean, you literally can end up on the street, starving and dying if you don't have this today. But, you know, that's not really a good reality, I would think, you know. Where you just because you have a low income or just because this is your reality, You might end up on the street and die.
But it has something to do as well with, as a lifeblood, it's something that's keeping community alive.
Is it money or funds?
Fun.
How is value determined?
Well, it's determined by every individual
Or,
and
or social construction.
yeah.
See, I think we're going on to talk about poverty and
Yeah,
too much and too little.
sure. That's part of it. That's part of the conceptualization. Have you ever heard of the concept of eradicating poverty?
Yes.
Have you ever heard of eradicating wealth?
Yes, extreme.
We don't talk about that in international development at all.
Not at all.
Yes,
No.
please.
Can I ask about, I've got this thing about universal dividend, and I think Iceland's got a thing about it too, and lots of countries have done a trial on it. Is that going into, are you going to say something about
So
that?
the reason why I'm asking you to think about this and grapple with it, and you're all getting a little, what's happening? That's important. Because it's in this discomfort that we start to realize the limits of our conceptual understanding. And we want to get our point across, but we're not really, this is discourse intervention.
Yes.
This is how we start to think differently about something. Do we need a system of exchange? Surely. Surely we do. Do we need to socially construct that system that only people with the Benjamins, as we call it in the States, the $100 bills, President Benjamin, yeah? So the Benjamins, is it the ones that have the Benjamins in their pocket that are valued more? Why? It's that social construction that Baha'u'llah is trying to challenge. It's that social construction that states in the Bible, it's easier to find to put the camel through a needle than find a rich man in heaven. It's not that money is bad, it's what we conceptualize it to do. So that's where I'm getting at. So be uncomfortable, good. Have that, what does this mean? What are we talking about when I say I need money for survival? Sure we do. But does that mean that's where we stop or begin? That's where we begin the conversation. Now, how do we incorporate the revelation into this discussion? Perhaps we start thinking about the value of human life differently than equating it with money.
Yes.
Perhaps we think about the value of the planet outside of extraction. Hold on, I'm sorry. In Brazil, the indigenous people of the Amazon have two ways to categorize human beings. All non-indigenous people are called extractivists. You're either indigenous or you're an extractivist. An indigenous framework of the planet, extracting means taking from the land, extracting oil. An indigenous framework conceptualizes our planet so differently. For example, the indigenous people of Colombia consider oil the blood of Mother Earth. And they're asking to stop depleting Mother Earth of her blood supply. What happens when you reconceptualize the planet in that way? It's not a romantic ideal. It is a sacred relationship with the planet. So what happens if we reconceptualize funds to make them a lifeblood and not merely the determination of value for a human being? It's different. Being able to really think about the edge of our understanding, that moment you all get uncomfortable, you all got uncomfortable and wanted to talk, that's where we should be all the time about everything, because Baha'u'llah has come to fundamentally alter the concepts that we work with every day. So it's not right, wrong, good, bad. It's what is the limit of my understanding? How can I bring in the revelation to help move this discourse in a direction that creates a new reality? Whether I'm talking with my child's mother, or I'm talking to the Baha'is of summer school, or I'm talking in a university with my students. You know when I teach basic research methods, my class is called Independent Investigation of Truth. And you know, it's like all the little chickens in my classroom, because they're all like, there's 300 students, and every time I put that on the board, the Baha'i student's head goes up highest. What's happening? Like a little chicken. I talk about the humble posture of learning all the time in my classes. Every student that walks out of my class knows what that means. And that means applying your knowledge and learning from it and reflecting with the community and then reapplying that knowledge. So I use the revelation constantly. I didn't mean to sound extractivist. I mean, I try to incorporate the revelation at every stage, and sometimes it's really challenging. Sometimes I don't know how to do it. Often I don't know how to do it. So I get challenged by the students, and I'm like, this is the limit. What I need to do some shifting and changing, but it's only in those spaces. In consultation, Abdul Baha says that truth comes from those clash of opinions. Don't let the clash destroy you and shy you away. Yeah.
It's interesting what you're using that concept. Discourse intervention has given me a whole new meaning of when the House of Justice talks about meaningful conversations.
Wonderful.
Honestly, because I've often struggled with the concept, what's a meaningful conversation? But all of a sudden now I see what it could actually be. Okay, change the concept.
I'm from Iceland.
Yeah. Some people really don't like this thinking thing, but we all appreciate the feeling thing. And I think in our faith we have this golden opportunity of community. We don't split into sects. We get together in community. The people are different. And if somebody hasn't got any money and is on the street or whatever, you'll get together for 19 days, you're going to care about that, and you will be sharing your money. We've got the construct to do that. You've got the construct to feel for people rather than just think.
Totally.
And I'm so enthusiastic about it.
I think that's the beauty of spirit and faith. The ability to bring them together. My father used to say the longest distance in the world is from the heart to the head. And back. The round trip is the longest distance in the world. So as you think about that, I'm feeling edgy for a break. I see you all. So let's take 10 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for listening.
Kindle the fire of love and burn away all things. Then set thy foot into the land of the lovers. Kindle the fire of love and burn away all things. Then set thy foot into the land of the lovers.
So we spoke a little bit about this discourse intervention, that's a theory, and that you can do it on multiple levels, right? We thought about how concepts and reconceptualization is important. One of the concepts that the House of Justice has been talking about over the last 10 years or so is something called the conceptual framework for action. You've seen that. I don't know if in Icelandic, how you translate this conceptual framework for action. What the House of Justice is talking about is our internal conceptual framework, right? I also think about a frame as being something really important to the way we make meaning. There's different frames. It's just as important how you filter something and make meaning of it, what you put in that frame and what you take out from that frame. It's really important. So a conceptual framework is like this lens that you see the world through. And as Baha'is, we see that lens through our understanding of the revelation of Baha'u'llah. So the deeper the understanding, the more impactful that frame. Does that make sense? And it's actually very expansive. So some of those things that the House of Justice talks about in the conceptual framework are the principles of the faith, and in our application of those principles, I think that's easy to understand. How do we apply the oneness of humanity? How do we apply gender equality? Thank you. How do we apply the agreement of science and religion? We can start to see that in this framework, we look at things differently, maybe our professions. Some of the deeper concepts, you mentioned governance earlier. Some of those deeper concepts can be unpacked a little bit. I wanted to focus on the concept of power and empowerment and how that shifts with the lens of the revelation. And by shifting it, how that can change our interactions, our political systems, our relationship with the land, everything. So the first action I want you to do, either on your own or talking to someone, is write down your definition of the word power. What is your definition? How are you framing? What is your conceptual framework of the word power? Maybe write a synonym for the word power, a few synonyms there. Power is embedded in empowerment.
Yes.
So I want to hear from you a little bit. What are some of the words that you used in the place of the word power?
Surrender.
Sorry? What did you say?
Authority.
Authority.
Energy.
What do you mean by energy?
You told me about electric power.
Oh, like electric power. Okay, okay. And like that kind of.
Work.
Work? What do you mean?
Energy network. They are connecting together.
Aha, okay. Sorry? Focus.
Control.
Control.
Oh, surrender.
When?
Train.
When?
I heard surrender.
Yes, surrender for me, submission, surrender.
The ability to do.
Submission.
Mo, if you tip it with the pen down
I
as
can't
you're
write
ready.
that way.
Oh, okay.
Somebody said the power to.
When?
Somebody said power with. What's the difference between power over? So this concept of authority and control,
Yeah.
to me, sounds like power over.
Yeah.
The energy is an interesting concept to think about with the term power. But these words, authority, control, are often associated with power in political conversations and discussions. This concept of having power over something is something we, especially in the West, conceptually are really used to. We're really used to that. It comes directly from the Frankfurt School of Sociology, actually, Weber. He talks about power as legitimacy, power over. There are some feminist writers that actually have challenged this framework conceptually. There's a woman, her name is Mary Parker Follett. She was an American organizational psychologist, never married, lived in the early part of the 19th century. She's kind of my soul sister. She said, no word is used more carelessly than the word power. And we don't understand this at all. Because if you have to coerce, oh, tak. If you have to coerce and dominate, you have lost power. So Mary Parker Follett talks about power with. Hannah Arendt, actually, a European political philosopher, talks about power with. actually, in the writings of Baha'u'llah, we see a reconceptualization of the word power. Did you know that? It's very much deeply embedded in the spiritual text, but also in discussions of governance. Think about the governance structure of the Baha'i system. Is there any control and authority given to individuals?
The word itself gives power to change things.
The word itself. Baha'u'llah says, think, be, and it is. Right? Like, according to Baha'u'llah, when God said be, it was.
And she is here.
I'm sorry, I was slow. I needed coffee. Think me, and there she is. Yes. There is a wonderful Baha'i scholar who I consider one of my mentors, Dr. Michael Carlberg. He is at Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. He actually wrote this amazing essay, which you would enjoy. It's called The Power of Discourse and the Discourse on Power. He distinguishes, first he goes through a historic overview of how the concept of power has shifted in academic discourse and politics. Then he gives a great example of the Baha'i community and our reconceptualizing power. And this is something that is published in non-Baha'i journal. So The Power on Discourse and the Discourse on Power by Dr. Michael Carlberg is highly recommended, especially if you're writing a master's thesis. In a letter dated the 2nd of March in 2013 to the Baha'is of Iran on non-involvement in politics, the House of Justice states, in the web of relationships alluded to that is taking shape and giving rise to a pattern of life, distinguished by adherence to the principle of the oneness of humankind, certain foundational concepts must be carefully examined. Most notable among them is the conception of power. Clearly, the concept of power as a means of domination, with the accompanying notion of contest, contention, division, and superiority, must be left behind. I'm going to read that sentence again. Most notable among them is the conception of power. Clearly the conception of power as a means of domination, authority, control, as a means of domination, with the accompanying notions of contest, contention, division, and superiority must be left behind. This is not to deny the operation of power. After all, even in cases where institutions of society have received their mandates through the consent of the people, power is involved in the exercise of authority. But political process, like other processes of life, should not remain unaffected by the powers of the human spirit. That the Baha'i faith, for that matter, every great religious tradition that appeared throughout the ages, hopes to tap. So what are those spiritual powers that we need to add to the discourse on power? The power of unity, the power of love, the power of humble service, the power of pure deeds. Associated with power in this sense are words such as release, encourage, channel, guide, enable. Power is not a finite entity which is to be seized and guarded. It constitutes a limitless capacity to transform, and that resides in the human race as a body. This paragraph is so important. How many of you remember this paragraph from the March 2nd, 2013 letter? 13. 2nd of March, 2013, in a letter by the House of Justice addressed to the people of Iran, specifically about non-involvement in politics.
Remember the letter with that in great detail. I should
Right?
be using it now. Yeah.
Like when I read this paragraph, it changed my dissertation. I was like, oh my God, I have to do this. Because, I'll tell you how I applied it. Engineers like to think about power over. I work with engineers all the time, right? Urban planning and engineering. Like, we're like two siblings that fight all the time. When I approached my transportation engineers that thought if you weren't dead on the road, you were healthy, remember? They believed their role in life was to take power over the environment to facilitate car transport. So I started doing some digging around the world where planners thought differently than power over. Believe it or not, it was the Dutch that said, we've been doing engineering all wrong. We've been trying to take power over the environment when we should be working with the environment. You have two examples of this in Iceland. You have a power over the environment and a power with the environment. It has to do with energy. What is the power with environment in the energy context and here in Iceland? Geothermal. Harnessing that power without major destruction to the environment. What is power over?
Dams.
Dams. Harnessing water by building a dam, power over nature, completely destroys the ecological environment, impacts communities that live downriver. In the United States and around the world, the communities that are hurt the most by dams are the communities that traditionally relied on the rivers for their livelihood. The thing that we have to remember is that technologically we've advanced so much as a society that engineers don't need to build dams. We have so many ways to help or work with the environment, power with the environment. In engineering and architecture and design, there is a reconceptualization of power which has completely changed the way people are designing. I mean, it seems like such a small concept, but it's huge. There's something called biomimicry. Have you heard of biomimicry here? Biomimicry is mimicking nature. So there are a group of engineers and architects and designers that are asking the question, why can't a building mimic a tree? What does a tree do?
Takes CO2 and gives oxygen.
Yes. It takes in carbon dioxide, gives off oxygen.
And they talk to each other on some level.
Sure, they talk to each other on some level. I don't know much about that part, but I know about the taking in of carbon dioxide, giving off oxygen. So there are engineers and architects that have designed experiential buildings that do just that. There's a building in Seattle, Washington called the Bullitt Center, which takes in carbon dioxide and gives off oxygen. Holy moly! Power with the environment. To me, the revelation of Baha'u'llah, reconceptualizing power, enables us not just to do no harm to the environment, but to do good. We tend to think as urban planners and engineers that it's okay to harm the environment a little bit. We don't have to harm the environment. So I want to hear from you a little bit. What are some of the words that you used in the place of the word power?
Surrender.
Sorry? What did you say?
Authority.
Authority.
Energy.
What do you mean by energy?
You told me about electric power.
Oh, like electric power. Okay, okay. And like that kind of.
Work.
Work? What do you mean?
Energy make work. They are connecting together.
Aha, okay. Sorry? Focus.
Control.
Control.
Oh, surrender.
Train.
When
I heard surrender.
Yes, surrender for me, submission, surrender.
The ability to do.
Submission.
Mo, if you tip it with the pen down
I
as
can't
you're
write
writing.
that way.
Oh,
Somebody said the power to.
when
Somebody said power with. What's the difference between power over? So this concept of authority and control,
Yeah.
to me, sounds like power over.
Yeah.
The energy is an interesting concept to think about with the term power. But these words, authority, control, are often associated with power in political conversations and discussions. This concept of having power over something is something we, especially in the West, conceptually are really used to. We're really used to that. It comes directly from the Frankfurt School of Sociology, actually, Weber. He talks about power as legitimacy, power over. There are some feminist writers that actually have challenged this framework conceptually. There's a woman, her name is Mary Parker Follett. She was an American organizational psychologist, never married, lived in the early part of the 19th century. She's kind of my soul sister. She said, no word is used more carelessly than the word power. And we don't understand this at all. Because if you have to coerce, if you have to coerce and dominate, you have lost power. So Mary Parker Follett talks about power with. Hannah Arendt, actually, a European political philosopher, talks about power with. And actually, in the writings of Baha'u'llah, we see a reconceptualization of the word power. Did you know that? It's very much deeply embedded in the spiritual text, but also in discussions of governance. Think about the governance structure of the Baha'i system. Is there any control and authority given to individuals?
The word itself gives power to change things.
The word itself. Baha'u'llah says, think, be, and it is. Right? Like, according to Baha'u'llah, when God said be, it was.
And she is here.
I'm sorry, I was slow. I needed coffee. Think be, and there she is. Yes. There is a wonderful Baha'i scholar who I consider one of my mentors, Dr. Michael Carlberg. He is at Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. He actually wrote this amazing essay, which you would enjoy. It's called The Power of Discourse and the Discourse on Power. He distinguishes, first he goes through a historic overview of how the concept of power has shifted in academic discourse and politics. then he gives a great example of the Baha'i community and our reconceptualizing power. And this is something that is published in Non-Baha'i Journal. So the Power on Discourse and the Discourse on Power by Dr. Michael Carlberg is highly recommended, especially if you're writing a master's thesis. In a letter dated the 2nd of March in 2013 to the Baha'is of Iran on non-involvement in politics, the House of Justice states, in the web of relationships alluded to that is taking shape and giving rise to a pattern of life distinguished by adherence to the principle of the oneness of humankind, certain foundational concepts must be carefully examined. Most notable among them is the conception of power. Clearly, the concept of power as a means of domination, with the accompanying notion of contest, contention, division, and superiority must be left behind. I'm going to read that sentence again. Most notable among them is the conception of power. Clearly the conception of power as a means of domination, authority, control, as a means of domination with the accompanying notions of contest, contention, division, and superiority must be left behind. This is not to deny the operation of power. After all, even in cases where institutions of society have received their mandates through the consent of the people, power is involved in the exercise of authority. But political process, like other processes of life, should not remain unaffected by the powers of the human spirit. That the Baha'i faith, for that matter, every great religious tradition that appeared throughout the ages, hopes to tap. So what are those spiritual powers that we need to add to the discourse on power? The power of unity, the power of love, the power of humble service, the power of pure deeds. Associated with power in this sense are words such as release, encourage, channel, guide, enable. Power is not a finite entity which is to be seized and guarded. It constitutes a limitless capacity to transform, and that resides in the human race as a body. This paragraph is so important. How many of you remember this paragraph from the March 2nd, 2013 letter? 13. 2nd of March, 2013, in a letter by the House of Justice addressed to the people of Iran, specifically about non-involvement in politics.
Remember the letter, but not in great detail.
Right?
It now. Yeah.
Like when I read this paragraph, it changed my dissertation. I was like, oh my God, I have to do this. Because, I'll tell you how I applied it. Engineers like to think about power over. I work with engineers all the time, right? Urban planning and engineering, like, we're like two siblings that fight all the time. When I approached my transportation engineers that thought if you weren't dead on the road, you were healthy, remember? They believed their role in life was to take power over the environment to facilitate car transport. So I started doing some digging around the world where planners thought differently than power over. Believe it or not, it was the Dutch that said, we've been doing engineering all wrong. We've been trying to take power over the environment when we should be working with the environment. You have two examples of this in Iceland. You have a power over the environment and a power with the environment. It has to do with energy. What is the power with environment in the energy context and here in Iceland? Geothermal. Harnessing that power without major destruction to the environment. What is power over?
Dams.
Dams. Harnessing water by building a dam, power over nature, completely destroys the ecological environment, impacts communities that live downriver. In the United States and around the world, the communities that are hurt the most by dams are the communities that traditionally relied on the rivers for their livelihood. The thing that we have to remember is that technologically we've advanced so much as a society that engineers don't need to build dams. We have so many ways to help or work with the environment, power with the environment. In engineering and architecture and design, there is a reconceptualization of power which has completely changed the way people are designing. I mean, it seems like such a small concept, but it's huge. There's something called biomimicry. Have you heard of biomimicry here? Biomimicry is mimicking nature. So there are a group of engineers and architects and designers that are asking the question, why can't a building mimic a tree? What does a tree do?
Take CO2 and give oxygen.
Yes. It takes in carbon dioxide, gives off oxygen.
And they talk to each other on some level.
Sure, they talk to each other on some level. I don't know much about that part, but I know about the taking in of carbon dioxide, giving off oxygen. So there are engineers and architects that have designed experiential buildings that do just that. There's a building in Seattle, Washington called the Bullitt Center, which takes in carbon dioxide and gives off oxygen. Holy moly! Power with the environment. To me, the revelation of Baha'u'llah, reconceptualizing power, enables us not just to do no harm to the environment, but to do good. We tend to think as urban planners and engineers that it's okay to harm the environment a little bit. We don't have to harm the environment. Is this too deep? You're with me? Yes, please.
Yes, I think a lot of this, today is just almost bad habit. I think a lot of people just, the engineers and all of these guys, I think they do it from a bad habit, but not, the new technology might not be moving fast enough to them and teaching them fast enough how to orchestrate this or something like that. But most of it is just bad habit, I think.
I think that's a really interesting frame. I would not judge it so much. I wouldn't say it's good or bad. I would say it's a habit.
Yeah.
And the greatest challenge we have is challenging our habits of thought, our habits of discipline, our habits of training, right? So, for example, I was invited to southern India to train a group of young engineers. In India, they have this high technical capacity for engineering, civil engineering, mechanical engineering, and they get no other education but technical capacity. So they don't understand policy, they don't understand anything. Environmental impact, health impact. And it's not that they don't want to understand, that's the training. Highly technical, highly technical. So when I talked about biomimicry, they got really nervous. Does that mean we have to get a degree in biology? They got so nervous. I was like, no, you just have to think a little bit. There's an amazing program called the Smart Village Revolution, which is led by this gentleman in India, who is trying to get engineers outside of the classroom and into the villages to think about how energy can be harnessed, power with community, to develop technologies that are more impactful in communities. So in this program, that's who invited me to India. So I went with the youth, really. They were youth who were trying pure intention to work with communities to make some kind of technology to advance human health and productivity. Not realizing that their desire for change was actually negatively impacting the community on occasion. So they have all this technical capacity. Oh, we can actually do something. Let's do something. Let's build a well here. We'll build a filtration system. We'll create a well. We'll take out all the bad bacteria. Not realizing they should actually test the water to make sure the mineral content doesn't have toxicity in it. If you have too much calcium, for example, you could harm a population. If you have too much of anything in that groundwater, you could harm the population. Too much fluoride in the water can harm the population. So walking around, I saw children had black teeth, and the engineering students were very proud of their work. And they were like, look, we built this well. We did this water filtration system that wasn't filtering out fluoride. And I had to be very careful, right? I couldn't be like, oh, they're all going to die. I couldn't do that. So together we decided that we would actually ask the medical school students to come and to do a test and to do a checkup, to check the water, to make sure that there was some type of communication and consultation so the youth didn't lose their enthusiasm. Because in that moment, I didn't want to exert authority and control. I could have very easily. I didn't want to do it. I wanted to make sure it was a power with, and it wasn't a condition where they were under threat immediately. So I didn't have to do power over. I could do power with. And actually, this process is embedded in the junior youth program. Oftentimes, we think of empowerment as control and authority of the community over junior youth. Remember those words the House discussed here? Associated with power in the sense of power with, this new reconceptualization, is the words release, encourage, channel, guide, and enable. Those to me are synonyms for empowerment.
Can I ask you what happened when those local people came?
Sure. They found there was high fluoride content and they had to filter the water differently. I left, but they continued the program so they can make sure that they had filtration systems that would filter out the fluoride. Some fluoride is okay, but the excess amount from that groundwater was negatively impacting the community. Then there's ways to think about this outside of that context. For example, how we design products. We design these products to have a finite life because consumerism is the value of today's money society. If instead we thought about sustainability, we would design this so that it didn't have a finite life, that it wouldn't have to go back into the environment. So if we have the technology and we can challenge those habits of thought, challenge the training mechanisms, imagine how different this world would be. And by the way, all of that comes from reconceptualizing power. Just one concept, the discourse intervention, can change an entire field. Policy frameworks. It's quite astonishing at the power of that revolutionary thinking. So I always think that the true revolution of the Baha'i revelation is conceptual. I want to read you this. Oh, sorry, please.
This thing about finite life, I think the other side, part of the other side of the story, yeah, but we give people jobs. Things wear out, we give people jobs. How are you going to get around that one? And I don't know if there's answers, AI and stuff like that, but there's questions on the other side, aren't they?
Totally, and you're absolutely right. What you're describing is strategies to deal with it. And I think that only comes with consultation. But if we don't reconceptualize, we don't know what we're consulting about, what strategies we are using to guide, you know? So oftentimes we tend to hear something that sounds like a habit of thought and we think excellent. Actually, no, not excellent. It only works if you don't change that concept, the foundational concept. If you change the foundational concept, the strategies might be different. Because guess what? The problems are different. The problem of building is not just development for tax income and jobs. The problem of development and buildings and roads become about how do we move people from place A to place B without harming the environment. The strategy for that is very different than getting access to a particular land to build for economic growth and progress. So it's about which values are we going to highlight? How are we going to reconceptualize so that harming the planet is not given impunity? Yes. For example, because I'm an urban planner, I think that way, right? And what does it mean to have a developed city? What does that even mean? Does that mean more buildings, more concrete? How do we plan and build? Because we have the technology, we have the science. What we don't have a lot is political will and reimagination. Being a Baha'i in these contexts is so fun. And it's so much fun to find another Baha'i in urban planning. It's so much fun. Because we're like, oh my God, come here, let's talk about this. About the reconceptualization of power, yes, oh my God, let's talk. We get so excited. It's kind of like we're thinking about something that's so innovative and revolutionary. And then our conversation becomes, how do we use this as a discourse intervention to change our field?
Well, wasn't there something about the power going from politics, what it is in America, from the politicians to the banks in the 70s that underpins what we're...
Sure, but we don't mind that because that's power over and we're not going to concern ourselves with power over. It still operates. Yeah. But what we want to do is reconceptualize and do this building of this new world order and not worry about the disintegrating old world order and conceptions of power. Because it's futile for us. I mean, I'm not an economist, so I can't address anything about banking, but I think going into that space of what I can contribute to in urban planning discourses, public health discourses, training new students, working with junior youth, thinking about how do I do discourse interventions in the spaces that that I can help a different conceptualization form it in the minds of my peers, my students. That's kind of where I get energy from and I sit in. Otherwise, I get very depressed if I think about this. Disintegration.
We need dialogue with the money people to see that there is a benefit in another way of looking at it.
Sure. I mean, I think you have to include private sector. So one of the things we've done, for example, in Southern California is make sure that the private sector is involved in concepts of affordable housing. Too many times it becomes the community activists and the government, and we forget to include the private sector, but they're part of it. So they're part of, if you think about reconceptualizing discourse, all elements of society need to have these consultations. So definitely that's part of the conversation. Even today, we see oil and gas companies that are asking for action for climate change. And that's a weird concept for us to think about, but we all recognize, maybe not to the level of the indigenous communities that believe oil is the blood of Mother Earth. That is one very deep, sacred, spiritual connection to the planet. Wouldn't it be amazing if we all thought that way? But in that space, there's also this space of people realizing we can't eat the oil.
Chief Dan George said that.
That's right. So how are we going to reconceptualize our living on this planet and with each other? I want to reread this paragraph, again from the 2nd March letter, because the words of the house are so much better than mine. If the web of relationships is to take shape and give rise to a pattern of life distinguished by adherence to the principle of the oneness of humankind, certain foundational concepts must be carefully examined. Most notable among them is the conception of power. Clearly, the concept of power as a means of domination, with the accompanying notions of contest, contention, division, and superiority, must be left behind. This is not to deny the operation of power. After all, even in cases where institutions of society have received their mandates through the consent of people, power is involved in the exercise of authority. But political processes, like other processes of life, should not remain unaffected by the power of the human spirit that the Baha'i faith, for that matter, every great religious tradition that has appeared throughout the ages, hopes to tap. That is the power of unity, of love, of humble service, of pure deeds. Associated with power in this sense are words such as release, encourage, channel, guide, and enable. Power is not a finite entity to be seized and jealously guarded. It constitutes a limitless capacity to transform that resides in the human race as a body.